all stakeholders was the general consensus around the value of the European Quality Assurance Framework, that it is broadly fit for purpose, particularly the principles. And I think that's, you know, we talk a lot about what changes are needed. We talk a lot about the criticisms of what's not working at the moment. But I think it is really important that we remember that the work that has already been done, you know, to this date is really appreciated and has had an impact and is considered generally to be working. From the agencies, we had a range of views about what else needed to be addressed, because there was a general consensus that there was space in the ESG to reflect better the current higher education environment and you know, can take into account the changes that we've seen in recent years. There's been a lot of debate among all stakeholders, but also amongst agencies about addressing some more cross-cutting issues, things like the social dimension of higher education, the fundamental values. And I think it's important to note that some aspects of these topics are already mentioned within the ESG, maybe not specifically in the standards, but certainly within the guidelines. So perhaps what we're looking at is scope for strengthening and perhaps expanding some of those references, rather than perhaps introducing, you know, whole new standards around these topics, because they are cross-cutting topics. They apply not just to teaching and learning, which is where the ESG are focused, but to all higher education institution activity. And the other thing that came quite strongly out of the survey to agencies is what we knew, of course, anyway, but that the activities of QA agencies go far beyond their work, their QA processes that fall, you know, directly within the scope of the ESG. So many agencies take on additional roles, such as being the ENQA or the qualifications body within the national system, but they also do a lot of quality assurance work that is beyond the scope of the ESG. So I think that's really important to highlight, that the ESG is the framework for certain sets of activities, but there's a lot that's going on beyond that, and some of these cross-cutting issues, some of these extra topics outside learning and teaching are already being covered by agencies. Not specifically related to the ESG, but one question that we asked our agencies was, what is it that you'd like to do but you can't? Because there's been a lot of criticism that current frameworks are too restrictive, they don't promote innovation. So what is it that you know that you want to be doing more of, or differently? And we were able to group the responses roughly into I think four categories. One was simplification. Sorry, 5 categories. One was simplification. Agencies want to make their processes easier and simpler for institutions. They want to be able to do more international activities. They want to be able to focus more on enhancement rather than the accountability side of quality assurance. They want to make changes to their legal frameworks in which they have to work. And they want to make better use of data and enhance the digitalization of QA processes. So that's their kind of the wish list. Of course, the natural follow-up question was, well, what is it that stops you from doing these things? The top answer that came out was national laws and policies. So I'm sorry, I'm talking to representatives of the ministries, but the blame kind of fell on those shoulders in terms of what prevents them from doing some of what they want to do. But then the next answer that came up was simply time and human resources. Interestingly, keeping in mind some of the criticisms about the ESG being restrictive or inhibiting innovation, only 8% of agencies said it was the ESG themselves that prevents them from doing these extra or different things that they want to do. So I think that's important to keep in mind, the sort of two sides to that discussion. The other kind of contradictory conclusion that came out of the sort of broader answers to the survey to agencies was that many agencies want to see more topics covered by the ESG, but they also want to improve their responsiveness and their flexibility. And I'm in two minds as to whether those two sort of strands of thought are contradictory or not, but I think we need to keep them in mind that what we set into the ESG does become a little bit restrictive. And we need to make sure that whatever the next version is as much as possible future-proof. Now, if we had this conversation a couple of years ago, very few of us in the room would have predicted what was coming over the next couple of years. But as far as possible, we need to make them not too concrete in the present moment that they don't allow for reacting to future changes. So just to finish off, I kind of leave us with three questions that to us at ENQA came out of the survey of things that we need to dig into a bit more deeply, and also that other stakeholders need to reflect on when it comes to the revision of the ESG. The first is, what is the purpose of the European Quality Assurance Framework? Because essentially the ESG are the tool that operationalize that. So we need to really go back to why we have a QA framework in the first place. The second question is, and this is one that Maria has mentioned regularly also when she talks about this work, is what is it that actually needs to be regulated at European level, and what actually can be left at national or agency level? What do we need to put into the European level framework? And the final question to reflect on is the difference between the ESG as a guiding framework, something that supports the work of institutions and agencies and sets them in the right direction, versus the ESG as criteria for compliance. And of course, as ENQA, we use that as our criteria for our membership, and of course it's criteria for registration on EQAR as well. And those two different purposes sometimes I think can be at odds with each other, and the direction that the ESG go, whether they are broader, whether they are go into more detail, will have an impact on the document's use for those two different purposes. So those are some reflections from my side. Thank you again for the invitation to make those comments.
Thank you. By the way, if you talk about students, there are student unions also in the framework. Okay.
Saying what?
Who is the student survey address?
Okay, yes. I'm gonna explain that. So, hello everyone, Horia Onița, Vice President of ESU, European Students Union. Regarding our survey, indeed, we had two separate surveys, one for the National Union of Students. And initially we had 24 responses from 23 countries. We reopened the survey and now we have 32 responses from 31 countries. So we are also now in the process of recalibrating the results. We had a look, they do not differ that much from what was originally worked upon, but of course they offer a broader legitimacy based on the number of answers. We also had a second survey, which we use like in a way in an advisory mode. We send that survey for our ESU QA pool student experts, those who are working basically hands-on on external, mainly QA reviews in external processes. I would start firstly with the issue of accountability, because as we've seen, that there is a high rate of response from governments in that direction. For me, it wouldn't come as a surprise at all, actually, because accountability is about public interest. In many countries, it is about public money. It is about legitimizing or recognizing qualifications or the right to issue diplomas. It is about the minimum standards of regulatory frameworks. And this is why I don't see as a surprise that this would be the most important issue for governments, taking into account the public interest, which is in many cases enshrined in law. And in this direction, I wouldn't say that necessarily NES's opinion has changed in this regard. There is still a very strong support for accountability as seen as a basis and a sine qua non in quality assurance. But also we've seen, for example, from 10 years ago that there is an increase in enhancement, which as also discussing last week with our NESs in our board meeting, which is our General Assembly, we've seen that basically they see that accountability is the main purpose or the basis for ensuring trust between countries, which is not a prerequisite, is a conclusion of the process. And then, of course, for those that are getting more developed, then you have the possibility to do enhancement, which is nicer. Of course, it is without all the checks and balances, but also it is something that is done after you ensure the minimum standards. In terms of the ESU's answer, I think it's by no surprise that there were high answer rates for the supporting, enhancing, or including more social dimension or fundamental values, which mainly we've seen this result for student and staff participation in higher education governance and academic integrity, a bit less for academic freedom, and institutional autonomy was one of the lowest for not only for students but for other stakeholders as well. And this is very much linked with the idea of how we define quality, which was also very clearly presented by Maria, because at least in NES's perspective, having an inclusive education is part of the essence of having a quality education. So these evolving views of the nature of how we define quality then of course impacts what we want to see in quality assurance. So that's something we've seen as a development. We also looked at how we implemented the current ESG. And for example, a very interesting conclusion was that student-centered learning as a new standard in the ESG 2015, NESs believe it was more appropriately addressed in external quality assurance than internal quality assurance. And that's something we need to reflect upon and to see why we see that these kind of changes from the European perspective are more easily taken from QA agencies at external QA level than trying to ingrain them in internal quality assurance. Regarding the vision of the ESGs, in this direction, if we exclude the I don't knows, there is clearly a support for reviewing all the parts, excluding the principles and purposes from the beginning. It is in a way a method also of interpreting the views, because on one hand we have stakeholders seeing that we shouldn't expand the ESGs, but then we have 2/3 majority from the stakeholders saying that we should have separate topics in the ESGs. And for NESs, except one or two areas, they see that basically everything should be in ESG part 1, which is of course impossible. So then it will be the method of reflecting in the next period what is actually meaningful and possible to be added in the ESG part 1, and what is only, you know, a wish list for higher education purposes in general, but without the QA being appropriate for that. But one thing where the NESs diverged clearly from the others is that they see the ESG to be more focused on conformity. They even have more than 70% saying that guidelines should be as much required as standards. So this is a method of seeing the minimum standards area or concept within the ESGs as a basis for trust and cooperation. And of course, all the other issues that expand from that as being add-ons and valuable extra activities, but that go beyond that. Based on that, also ESU issued, our board issued a statement last week adopted by our General Assembly, which is the board meeting on general issues and purposes, where they concluded that ESU wants to have a review of the ESGs. I think it was pretty obvious by now, but I'm just mentioning here. And finally, regarding the purposes of the European QA framework, we've seen clearly again that there is a high level of support for two relevant issues. Firstly, for the recognition and for enhancing trust at European level, but we also have seen that they want to go beyond the topics and to see the European quality assurance framework as a leadership towards change. And that's very interesting, because on one hand, we have the interpretation that ESGs should be the minimum required for quality assurance agencies to operate internationally, but we also have the discussion on what we put on the ESGs and left for national level. But if we basically these two are diverging views, because if we see the ESGs only as the minimum and then the national level can add on anything in the national framework, then the QA agency should look into what they need to comply with at national level in different countries. But then if we see the ESGs as the minimum, but also the only necessary tool, then of course we need to see what we put in the ESGs, irrespective of what we add in the national level. So of course there are some maybe contradictions in a way on how we put the questions themselves, and how even the same category of stakeholders sees this kind of clear picture or architecture of European QA. And I think that right now we don't have clear answers. We will have a lot of discussions also in EQAR and of course with all the stakeholders and decision makers on how we refine this. But I think that right now we do see some clear trends and even some diverging trends among stakeholders.
Thank you.
Thank you.
May I have the mic? Just. Just a few minutes to reflect on what we just heard. Now the German frontal axis is restored again, which is a good thing in the European world, isn't it? Let's check about what we've heard, because the good thing for all of us is the ESG play a role. Quality assurance has played a role for 15 or 25 years. ENQA played a role, EQAR played a role. The higher education institutions see the added value of quality assurance. The students see the added value, but we are not in agreement on how exactly to fill it and to feel how we are going to develop further. And we all know that it's a lot of work to revise the ESG. And it's good to look at the governmental members, whether they realize what an enormous lot of work comes over you if you start revising the ESG with all stakeholders in Europe and what we are going to do. And for me, one of the most important questions would be, is there one size fits all? Could there be a QA framework where all stakeholders would say, oh yes, that's fine? Or has it to do, as you asked, Maria, with a kind of geographical difference between countries, within countries even? Who is asking a question or who's giving an answer? To start with, someone has to start. Let me take the Irish as an example, because your quality agency is, you might say, on the most liberal side. The ESG and the frameworks are very restricted, and they feel restricted in what they are doing. Why is that?
I suppose we like to have the idea of an open and flexible system, and one that is quite responsive. So having a framework there is useful, but you don't want to have enhancement needing to demand consumers that focus.
Then Foreign walks up to the ministry and says, now I have you. We are going for enhancement. What is the government's view on that? Is it difficult to have an answer and to say, we also think that accountability is an important part of what's going on?
No, indeed, and I think that's a balance that we're looking at the moment, in terms of looking at a new regulatory framework for international education provision, and how we can balance that against the idea of having that flexibility while ensuring the accountability is there, and we're getting our return for investments in the sector as well. On that front, but then again, it's possible investing in that model. That has and obviously take part of watches give us on board.
Yeah, you have to take that on board. Otherwise, you don't make yourself loud and clear heard. But that's you might say you are at the most advanced part, because Borg is one of the people who is always telling us that the ESG are too restrictive. But there are also countries on the other side. The ESG have just started. I don't see representatives from Montenegro, from Bosnia, from Serbia, but they all know that they just started with quality assurance. Would someone explain that it's of course a balance between accountability and enhancement? I can imagine that enhancement has become more important after 25 years of quality assurance and accountability. there is also the other side of the coin, isn't it? So please, Ukraine. Okay, please.
I don't know whether I would answer directly your question, but we are quite new really in implementing quality assurance system. We have a long history of quality assurance, but according to European standards, quite new. And we definitely feel the problem with let's say enhancement of quality. And one of the reasons, aside from war and COVID, really, one of the reasons is the size of country. So transferring to another system, new system of quality assurance, you have to cover the thousands of programs. And we had originally the quality assurance, which was voluntary. And universities applied for quality assurance and they passed it. And there was better, let's say, timing because it was smaller number. And it's actually the best submitted because it was voluntary. So they have, and you can give the test. And now later we changed the legislation and it became mandatory if you wish to graduate. And then just it happened to be that this is the tremendous amount of work that you have to fit in smaller number of time because you need to graduate students. And in this case, the accountability is definitely the priority. So for me, it's I think that enhancement is for me personally, it would be more important, probably purpose than only accountability. But the sizes really make this work really difficult. It's not directly related to ESG as is, but it is related to functioning of the whole system. And the question that I have, it's about the size fits all. We spoke about different stakeholders, but there is one more aspect which I think recently, and this is general rules for all professional systems. For example, when you apply, and I'm originally from health sector, so I think the universal approach principles are the same, but one agency probably it's very difficult to cover all professional areas. Just I don't think, well, we do form the professional expert groups and so on, but still it's the leadership does not have specific knowledge in health, for example, and it's quite hard to, it's easier to miss, let's say, let me just say. So it's also an aspect that should be taken care of if we are going to review the industry.
If you would like to interfere.
What a question, Carl.
Yes.
Interfere. Yes, I want to interfere. No, but doesn't it all come down to trust? I mean, my interpretation is that a lot of those differences can be both between different systems, kind of considering the maturity, as we call it, of the quality assurance system. So those were for 25 years, there's been a system in place, trust has been built, people know what this is all about. There's perhaps less kind of will or wish to go for more regulation because there seems to be not the need for that. And that could also explain some of the differences between the stakeholder groups. I mean, of course, institutions trust themselves. I mean, more or less. I mean, so, you know, to say so. So I think that's why institutions were the ones who always said less, you know, fewer standards, scope is okay, don't extend it, etc. And it's also very logical that the students say, no, the more you regulate, the better, because we need the guarantees.
Yeah.
And we kind of trust, but we don't really trust. And then the agencies find themselves kind of in the interplay of these. And then there's also the ministry, and they have to kind of put these together. So I think trust and kind of the development of trust can explain quite a bit of those differences. Sorry for the interference.
Thank you so much for the intervention. Horia.
Maria started the reply. Yeah, thank you, thank you. Indeed, I mean, I agree with Maria that it's a matter of trust, but at least in public policy, you cannot have ultimate trust, because that's why you need regulations to ensure that that is in place, because otherwise you wouldn't have a law, because if everyone trusts each other, you don't need a law. And a part of that, I think one thing it's the trust within a system where it can grow very much in a specific national or federative national system, and then there is the European or international level trust, which is more administrative based. So you cannot say that by default, just because you are a group of representatives that socialize with each other and have peer learning activities policies, you trust each other on this level, but then you will always need to have this kind of guarantees in international cooperation, because that's how it works. And regarding the ESGs being too restrictive, I think here it's about coming back again on seeing what's the role of ESGs, because if you see them as the minimum tool, then you can do whatever you want afterwards at national level. If you see them as the only thing that can be happening in QA, then of course there may be specific points that particularly could be very restrictive. But just to end, in a way, this kind of discussion with accountability and enhancement, in a way also I would put it in a Blaise Pascal bet, because if you are looking at enhancement and you are not looking at accountability, and you are in a system that works well, everything is going well and you didn't lose anything. If you are looking only at enhancement in a country where you don't have the minimum standards, then you bet it on enhancement, but you lost the minimum standards, and then you lose the quality criteria. So it's in the end a bet of finding the balance of it.
It is indeed, but I always have thought that there was a combination possible between accountability and enhancement. And the longer I have been in business, the more I doubt that it's possible. But that's probably the age. So let's go to a younger person. Peter? I'm going to ask you about so they can start with quality assurance.
Yeah, what we're trying to move from the study program accreditation to the institutional accreditation, and right now we are waiting for the report of ENQA from the site visit. So that's the
position that you have in your company, things like enhanced accountability. What's important in the case of the education that you are at? Well, you don't have to do anything. Something of that is yes.
Yeah, so just okay.
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question, please? Because I most focus on microphone than the hearing you. Sorry, because I saw Melinda behind, like doing something. Sorry.
The question was, how if you have a discussion between three stakeholders about the enhancement role of the agency and the accountability role, seeing the situation where you are higher education is at the moment.
Well, when the reform started, I was not part of the discussion because I started work at the ministry later. So I actually don't remember everything. Sorry for it. So the reform is older than my position. But there was a lot of discussions, I think, but I was not really into it, also the whole system. But we have a lot of stakeholders, and it's quite important to include the stakeholders. And this was also one of the main topics or main challenges, how to involve the stakeholders and how to create the whole system. And now I find how the microphone works. And it's still the question. And also from the SEQA ESG project, it was one of the topics we were most interested for, because there's a lot of stakeholders, and it was quite hard to find a way how to connect higher education institutions to the stakeholders like the employers, because there was like two different systems or worlds when they didn't communicate. And I think we started the first step, but we are not at the position we want to be, and because it's still a lot of work in front of us to complete. So
Slovenia.
Many thanks. I'm here for the first time. Jednej is my name. Anyway, I think in Slovenia, there is a gradual transition from accountability to enhancement. At least enhancement is getting ever more enhanced. But at the same time, we are in the process of renovating the legislation in the field of higher education, and the direction we took is deregulation. And during this course, I think that the matter of accountability again is popping up and becoming more important, because if you deregulate on the one hand, then there are voices to strengthen accountability on the other, also from the students and other stakeholders. Just so much for consideration. Thank you.
Yep. Quite a system of accountability in the first years of the existence of your agency, wasn't it? There was quite a lot. So you can say there's a basis of trust in the higher education systems and in the programs. That's what you established. Okay. Belinda.
Yeah, I'm sorry to intervene. We do have to keep it very short because we get into coffee break. But I do want to ask members, because I think it's very important to know whether there's something we should definitely have in the ESG, that we should something that we have not maybe addressed here. Because I think that is also one of the questions we had for this session. And so if you feel like there's something that we should have and it's not mentioned here, please let us know. And then, of course, you can take the discussions in the coffee break.
Never discussed during the coffee break. But I understand your hint. Yes. That means that we have to start with the meeting, the official meeting. And you have seen the draft agenda. And we have to do quite a number of things before 6 o'clock. And we'll manage. And let me first start with